Welcome, everyone. I would like to call the meeting to order. My name is Catherine Page. I am the Sacatum Chair, and I am with the Clorox Company. We're going to go round the room first, this side of the table, and then come all the way back round so that everybody can introduce themselves, and we'll make sure everyone in the room is covered in a second. Okay, we'll start with Nicole.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Dr. Nicole Kleinsteuer. I am the Director of the NTP Interagency Center for the Evaluation of Alternative Toxicological Methods, or NICETM, and the Executive Director of the Interagency Coordinating Committee for the Validation of Alternative Methods, or ICVAM. And I thank all of our SACADM members for being here today to provide us with your incredibly valuable feedback and expertise. And I thank all of our audience members, both in the room and online, for your participation.
If we can just stick to introductions as well, no opening remarks. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Anna Lowett. I am a Senior Science Advisor in EPA's Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics, and have had the honor for the last 10 years of being one of the co-chairs of ICVAM.
Yes, this is John Gordon, toxicologist with the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and also co-chair of ICVAM.
Hi, Stepan Baran, SACADM member and Chief Scientific Officer at Verisim Life.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Johnny Forsch. I lead the data science and modeling team at EarthBio, and especially all the computational toxicology efforts for EarthBio.
My name is Adrian Añez. I spent the first half of my career in toxicology at Amgen Incorporated in pharma, and the second half in medical affairs, and currently with Servier.
Good morning. My name is Tamara Tall. I'm a group leader at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research in Germany, and also hold a professorship in integrated systems toxicology at Leipzig University. I am a SACADM member.
Hi, my name is Sue Marty. I'm a science leader in toxicology at Dow Chemical.
Hello, I'm Warren Casey. I'm Director of Strategic Partnerships in the Division of Translational Toxicology here at NIEHS, and I'm a ICVAM member.
Good morning, Charles Kovach. I'm the U.S. National Coordinator to the OECD Test Guideline Program based at the U.S. EPA Office of Chemical Safety Pollution Prevention.
Hi, Natalia Venus, Department of Defense. Sorry, I'm late. Hi.
Hi, good morning. Sally Thompson-Aratani. I am from the University of Washington, where I am the Assistant Vice Provost overseeing Animal Care Outreach and our 3Rs program. And I am ad hoc. I'm hoping to get all the approval for the paperwork soon, so happy to be here. Thank you.
Nathan Price, I'm the Chief Science Officer for Thorne Health Tech, also an on-leave professor at the Institute for Systems Biology. Also ad hoc, brought all the rest of my paperwork with me, so hopefully we'll be done.
Hi, I'm Misty Ushio. I'm a managing partner at Digitalis Ventures and formerly founder and CEO of Terra Biosystems, which develop in vitro models.
Good morning, everyone. Priyanka Sura. I'm a toxicologist with Gilead Sciences. I'm a SACADM member.
Good morning. I'm Sue Leary, President of Alternatives Research and Development Foundation, and I'm a SACADM member.
Hello, I'm Ellen Berg. I'm a member of SACADM, and I am a principal and CSO at Alto Predict.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Melanie Brownlow. I'm a health scientist at the Division of Translational Toxicology at NIEHS, and I'm also the designated federal officer for SACADM.
Good morning. My name is Robert Sills, and I'm the Acting Scientific Director for the Division of Translational Toxicology. We appreciate all your advice and the important role you play on the committee, and thanks for joining us today.
Okay, I'd like to take the opportunity now to have the ad hoc SACADM members that are virtually joining us to briefly introduce themselves, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Christina Miles, and I'm a regulatory toxicologist with Murion Chemicals, and I'm an ad hoc member of the SCATM.
Hello, everyone. My name is Patricia Silveira. I'm an associate professor and the chair of the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health at Indiana University and an ad hoc.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to continue to go down the room. We're going to do this side first, and yeah, we'll start with this table, please.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Helena Hochbar. I'm a staff scientist with NICEDM.
Hey, Kemal Mansouri, also at NICEDM, computational chemist.
I'm Dave Allen from Innovative Incorporated, principal investigator for the contract supporting NICEDM.
Brian Oliver, I'm in the intramural program at NIH Bethesda, and we're also a member of the Precision Tox Consortium.
Good morning, Anne Gourmelon from the OECD. I'm a principal administrator for the test guidelines program.
Hey. Sorry, just a second. Can we do this table, please?
Hi, I'm Stephen Moorfield. I'm the project manager for Innovative supporting NICEDM.
Kathy Sprankle, communications specialist, Innovative supporting NICEDM.
And Mary.
Good morning, I'm Mary Wolf. I'm a Deputy Division Director for the Division of Translational Toxicology at NIHS. Welcome.
And can we do this side of the room first, please, with the chairs?
Hi, good morning. Rishan Fernando, RTI International.
Good morning. Sorry, my name is Bridget Hill, and I am a toxicologist at Innovative supporting NICEDM.
Hi, I'm Carrie Melanzak. I am from Helena and working as nutritional biology and safety head.
Hi, I'm Patricia Seeger. I'm a toxicologist at RTI International.
Hi, everybody. My name is Daniel Lim, and I'm from the industry. I'm from a startup based in Korea, and we're addressing variability from technical issues in organoid production.
Okay, and then this side, please.
I was waiting my turn. Good morning, Janet Hilton. I am a toxicologist working for the PETA Science Consortium International.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Monique Perrin. I'm the Senior Science Advisor for EPA's Office of Pesticide Programs.
Good morning, I'm Emily Ranke, Principal Toxicologist at Innovative supporting the NICEDM contract.
Elizabeth Baker, Director of Research Policy, Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine.
I'm Anna Kreutz. I'm a Senior Predictive Toxicologist at Innovative.
Hi, I'm Bridget Rogers. I'm an Associate Scientist with the PETA Science Consortium International.
Hi, I'm Megan Colbreth. I'm a Developmental Neurotoxicologist with PETA Science Consortium International.
Amy Klippinger, PETA Science Consortium International.
Agnes Carmaus, Syngenta Crop Protection.
Good morning, my name is Sonia and I'm a toxicologist with CIFSAN FDA.
My name is Matthew Lindman. I'm Assistant Scientific Director at Verto Solutions, a scientific trade association management company.
Good morning, I'm Hans Rabi. I'm with the Institute for In Vitro Sciences, Chief Operating Officer.
Good morning, everyone. Jeffrey Davis, Syngenta Crop Protection Toxicology.
Good morning, I'm Brianna Jackson, and I'm a toxicologist at Syngenta.
Good morning, everyone. I am Tiffany Zapata. I'm a toxicologist at Syngenta.
Okay, and now I'd like to take the opportunity to acknowledge that we have representatives from the International Cooperation on Alternative Test Methods, or ICATM, that are viewing the meeting remotely today. And then whilst we have had some ICFAM members, representatives that have introduced themselves already in the room, we also have additional representatives that are joining online. And now we move into the welcome portion. I would like to introduce the ICFAM co-chair, Anna Lowett. to provide welcoming comments.
So good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining. Thanks for the SACADA members, both here in the room and those online. We understand it takes a lot of time to prepare for these meetings. In fact, there was some on the shuttle this morning talking about how much material there was to read. So we appreciate the time you've put in, not only to prepare for this meeting, but also to take time away from your regular daily lives to come and spend with us and provide your insight on the work that ICFAM and NICEDM are doing over the next couple of days. It is incredibly valuable to our programs as the federal family advances the 3 Rs and bring NAMs into our programs, and importantly, from my point of view, really start making more and more regulatory decisions on them as NAMs really represent the best science. I also want to thank members of the public who are here, not only to give public comments, but to listen and to learn just like the rest of us. So looking forward to the next couple of days.
Thank you, Anna. I'd like to introduce ICFAM co-chair John Gordon, who will also provide welcoming comments.
Well, I think Anna summed it up really nicely there. Thanks everybody for being here. It's great that we can get it together in person. I know I've been on many emails and webinars with most of you, and I'm going to be walking around the room making little insights so I can figure out who you are for sure, because I've had many emails and conversations with you but never seen you in person. So this is wonderful that we can actually get together and have a conversation in person. And yeah, Anna summed it up great. Really grateful for everyone's input today. Really looking forward to it. It's just this and the public forum are just fantastic days for me and Anna, I know as well, and getting feedback from outsiders. Because you get in your own little bubble, you start, you don't get all the extra ideas, and that's what we're really looking for today.
Thank you, John. And I'd like to introduce NICEDM Director Nicole Kleinstra, who will provide welcoming comments.
Thank you, Chair. So not much to add to what Anna and John said, just to say that we are incredibly grateful to all of you for your expertise and for your time. You were all selected, all the SACADA members were selected because of your strengths in various scientific areas, and so we're really looking forward to the feedback that you're going to provide us over the next 2 days. And so thank you all for being here. Thank you all to members of the public and the scientific community for your presence as well, both online and in the room.
Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce our designated federal official, Dr. Brownlow, to provide some housekeeping statements.
Thank you. I'd like to make brief just housekeeping statements, but also read our conflict of interest statement. So members of the Scientific Advisory Committee on Alternative Toxicological Methods, or SACADM, serve as individual scientists and not as representatives of any organization. Each member is to exercise judgment prior to or during the meeting as to whether a potential conflict of interest might exist relative to the topic under discussion due to his or her occupational affiliation, professional activity, or financial interests, or those of their spouse, minor child, partner, or organization. Members are asked to bring to the attention of the federal official any potential conflict of interest that might pertain to a topic being considered at the meeting. Should there be a potential conflict of interest, it will be handled in accordance with departmental policies and requirements. Thank you. And for housekeeping, SACADM Charter states that SACADM provides advice to the NIEHS Director and NTP, ICFAM, and NICEDM regarding ICFAM activities. This is a public meeting that is being broadcast to a remote audience. When speaking, please remember to introduce yourself for the listening audience. Additionally, since this is a public meeting, we ask that all panelists reserve the use of the Zoom chat box to technical issues only. All discussions in this meeting will take place in the public forum and captured in the meeting minutes. I'm briefly going to give an overview of the meeting format. So for the most part, the meeting will have the following format. Each session speaker will give their presentation. SACADM members will then be invited to ask clarifying questions of the speakers, and speakers will be given an opportunity to respond. After all speakers have given their presentations, the chair will invite individuals who have registered to make oral presentations to speak. Speakers will be asked to identify themselves and state their affiliations. CICATA members will then have an opportunity to ask clarifying questions of the commenter. Following public comments, the chair will call on assigned discussants for their comments. After the assigned discussants have completed their comments, the chair will open the discussion to all members of CICATA. Please note that it's unnecessary to repeat comments from previous discussants beyond perhaps agreeing with them. While we have a scheduled lunch break for each day, the actual time may vary and will be at the discretion of the chair. Slides will be made available on the website as soon as they meet government requirements for accessibility. And minutes will be posted to the website once they have been reviewed for accuracy by CICATA members and approved by the chair, made available on the website as soon as they meet the government requirements for accessibility. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Perfect.
Just remember, please, if you're in the room, silence your phones. If you have any conversations, please take them out to the hallway. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to move on to our first topic, which is 5 years into ICFAM's strategic roadmap, full replacement of the acute toxicity six-pack. Please hold all discussion questions for CICATA members. Please hold all discussion questions until the discussion session after all presentations. Yeah, Dr. Wojcik will join us later and provide welcoming remarks at that point. Thank you, Dr. Allen. Please go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Page. So I've been asked to give some highlights of 5+ years of progress in a short amount of time, so buckle up. Again, I'm Dave Allen. I'm from Initiv, the contractor supporting NICEDM. So I don't think I need to remind folks about a strategic document that was developed really that came out of this body about 8 years ago, the concept of a strategic document. But certainly the central theme around connecting end users with the developers, establishing new validation approaches, and ultimately assuring adoption of new technique. And I think the agenda that's set forth for us the next 2 days provides a nice overview of what's been going on. Certainly not coincidentally, a couple years preceding that document publication, former director of EPA's Office of Pesticide Programs, Jack Hausinger, released a strategic vision to really come up with a non-animal six-pack, where you can see the 6 acute toxicity assays in the left-hand panel, and the ultimate impact that could have on animal use for the registration of agrochemicals and pesticide products within the agency. So that led forth the implementation plan associated with the strategic roadmap, really initially aligned to these 3 major topical areas, and ultimately coordinating those activities through ICFAM work groups, creating scoping documents to understand all the requirements and needs across the agencies, and identifying, meticulously curating data and utilizing those for the development and evaluation of new methods. So certainly starting with the end user in mind is really a central tenet we've followed for the last several years, and you can see 3 really salient publications over that time frame that have summarized in pretty great detail the agency needs, requirements, and probably most importantly perhaps, the opportunities for the application and use of NAMs for these regulatory endpoints. So starting with acute dermal pesticide toxicity testing, where we can really claim victory in that area as a result of a few retrospective evaluations looking at both pesticide active ingredients and pesticide products, where we had parallel acute oral toxicity and acute dermal toxicity data, LD50s from each. And really almost without exception, you could show from a conservative approach that labeling associated with that acute oral LD50 would provide sufficient health protection, and thus you could justify waiving the acute dermal toxicity test altogether. Then moving to acute oral systemic toxicity, certainly a number of areas, active ongoing areas. Dr. Kamal Mansouri led really a Herculean effort of 35 groups amongst the global modeling community to really crowdsource a curated data set of over 10,000 acute oral LD50s, and utilizing that with a variety of QSAR techniques to build predictive models for about 5 different endpoints. And ultimately, Dr. Mansouri pulled those together into a consensus ensemble approach that could really leverage the strengths of each of those methods to come up with predictive tools or predictive approaches for acute oral toxicity. And then, of course, a central theme also along the way is evaluating variability associated with the reference test methods. So Agnes Farmouse led an effort to really pull together those 10,000 plus LD50s and meticulously curate both computationally and with human eyes with the NICEDM team to pull together the replicate values and understand really what the variability across those LD50 values were, and develop sort of a confidence interval that could be applied to LD50 values. And then Kamal, in the CATMOS model, was able to leverage that confidence interval and calculate a range of LD50 values associated with that to ultimately show that the CATMOS model was at least as predictive, if not better, than the in vivo test itself of predicting itself. So now we're extending that to acute inhalation toxicity. Again, a Herculean effort from the NICEDM team, pulling together acute LC50 values, and we have the added complexity in the acute inhalation space of really the factor associated with physical form and physical state of the substance and how that impacts hazard classification and labeling. So a number of curation approaches. The busy workflow there really just shows the extent to which some calculated decisions are made ultimately to create this acute inhalation database that is soon to be available again in a similar fashion for a modeling effort. So then as we move into the topical toxicity endpoints is where we've really begun to apply those human-based comparison approaches. This group has heard before the extent to which the variability associated with both in vivo skin and eye irritation. The table there shows in vivo eye irritation data, and the extent to which using conditional probabilities, you can show how well it predicts itself. And the yellow shaded boxes, you can clearly see, particularly in that mild to moderate irritant range of 2A and 2B, where actually if you were to repeat the test, it'd probably be more likely to give you a different answer altogether. So perhaps the in vivo test itself is the way we've been using a one-to-one comparison for more than 2 decades is evaluating NAMs. Maybe that is not the best approach, and perhaps we should consider the strengths and limitations of all methods collectively. So Amy Clippinger published a paper in 2021 that really was that survey of the strengths and limitations across all available methods, both in vitro and in vivo, to understand the relevance to human ocular anatomy. And then, of course...
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you great, Dr. Wojcik.
Okay, I can't hear you, so why not? Just a minute.
I'll pause for the director. Okay, I'll keep going until he stops again. So anyway, understanding the relevance to human ocular anatomy associated with all methods therein, and perhaps a better way is to look across a consensus approach. So we've done some prospective testing to look closer at the applicability domain of some of these methods, both OECD test guideline methods and some newer methods that have been developed along the way. And I won't go through the busy slide here, but suffice it to say, we've had a really wonderful industry cooperation of donating agrochemical formulations to be applied in prospective testing. And the busy table here is intended to show that evaluation across a consensus of methods. So Amber Daniel has led an effort to look at just that, really to calculate or create a consensus calculation or classification based on all of the results from both in vivo and in vitro assays. And you can see a lot of green there, which means there's agreement with the consensus classification. And where you see red, that's where the protective equipment associated with the result would be under protective or not classified, for example. And you can see on the far right-hand column that 2 of those are actually the in vivo test itself. So perhaps, again, comparing directly to the in vivo method is not necessarily the most predictive way to do this, and we should be looking more closely across a number of methods that have human relevance. And this very busy slide is just it's in poster form and really in draft form at the EPA level that just emphasizes their commitment and progress towards creating a decision tree that prioritizes in silico and in vitro data before in vivo data. So I don't think I need to go through the AOP associated with skin sensitization. That's been certainly talked to at length in a number of meetings here and this group as well. And you'll hear more about some computational approaches from Kim To tomorrow. But a defined approach associated with skin sensitization aligned to those key events associated with skin sensitization and available methods have been developed. And so for the first time, a couple years ago, an OECD guideline was adopted. It's a fully non-animal approach to skin sensitization testing. And this slide includes 3 of those defined approaches, 2 of which are reflected in the guideline. The one in the top right-hand panel is actually one that's been integrated in some policy decisions within the EPA. But importantly, a lot of those defined approaches were believed to be perhaps restricted towards cosmetic ingredients, quote unquote, even though many of those chemicals are industrial chemicals that are much beyond cosmetic formulations. So we actually, ICFAM went out and we collected nominations from ICFAM agencies, and we came up with 181 substances that were actually nominated for testing in these in vitro methods. We've done that survey, done the testing in conjunction with the NTP contractor to calculate or generate those data in each one of those in vitro methods so we could evaluate these defined approaches and expanding the applicability domain. In the far left-hand panel of the heat map, you can see a comparison of those defined approaches and individual methods to the local lymph node assay or the reference test method at the time. And you can see the performance associated with predicting the LNA is really about the same as the LNA is at predicting itself. And certainly a keen eye would look at those data and say, well, all of those numbers look very similar. Why do we need a defined approach if we can use a single method and come up with basically the same answer? I think that gets back to the importance of the adverse outcome associated with skin sensitization and establishing confidence in these approaches and having that full span of the AOP associated with what you're putting into the defined approach. Because this is just a subset of chemicals. If we think about the broader chemical universe, it's important to understand all of that biology. And last but certainly not least, a recent collaboration within Nicedum and Unilever Corporation is expanding a computational model that they built, skin allergy risk assessment model, to include data in the integrated chemical environment that you'll hear a lot about tomorrow afternoon. But importantly, this is a Bayesian approach that actually creates a metric for potency that can be used in skin sensitization assessments. And it utilizes data inputs from many of those assays that I just talked about, all aligned with that adverse outcome pathway associated with skin sensitization. And we've recently provided all the data from the testing that I just mentioned to Unilever so they can then run those results for those 181 compounds through the SARA ICE model. And this is actually on the OECD work plan for integration into that guideline that I mentioned for defined approaches. So as I mentioned, we can claim success in dermal lethality, the systemic toxicity associated with that. We're really close with many of the endpoints in between, systemic toxicity by both the oral and inhalation routes. One of the things I didn't mention with the oral and inhalation is we've also looked closely at an additivity calculation for mixtures and formulations, where you can mathematically leverage values from individual LD50s of the component mixture and come up with a calculated LD50 associated with that. And we've shown that to be quite predictive, particularly for non-toxic substances in the oral realm, and we're trying to expand that to inhalation. And certainly skin sensitization, we've created the holy grail of a fully non-animal approach that's really exciting. So certainly this is a tremendous effort by a really large team. Certainly Dr. Klein-Schroer leads the overall team. There are a number of folks pictured here. There's a few in the room that aren't in the picture that are former members of the team that were a big part of this as well. So with that, I think I've achieved my window of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. I would like to ask any Sakata members who might have clarifying questions to please direct those at this time to Dr. Allen, but please do not start your reviewer commentary. Please hold that till later.
Thank you, Dave, for the nice presentation and a quick, nice overview. Just a quick question on the guard sense. Although it's been developed as a replacement for HCLAD, but it's at the same time looking at the genome expression, and the developers say that it looks at the entire spectrum of the key events. Any thoughts or on that? Because you might get a genomic signature which might allude to being a sensitizer, and at least the developers, at least based on what I've read, is that they suggest you can use it as a standalone as well, but OECD is saying otherwise you have to use 2 out of 3. So just wanted to get some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so there's a question given the endpoints associated with the guard skin, which I'm sorry I didn't go into detail on the slide, but it is, as you mentioned, has genomic endpoints and is perhaps more comprehensive than the cell-based HCLAD.
Correct, yeah.
And the argument that it could be as a standalone, yes, I'm sure from the industry or the developer side, that they're very, they believe that for sure. It's been closely looked at for that. Actually, what we did in that defined approach assessment that I glossed over is actually Emily Ranke looked closely at guard skin as a drop-in replacement for the HCLAT in that defined approach, and actually showed it's slightly better. I mean, it's definitely as good as, but actually a little bit better.
Better in the sense, is it over-predictive or?
I think it still suffers from the same, I believe it's false positive. There's a lot associated with that assay. So it still suffers from that, but from a conservative perspective, it's quite good.
Thank you.
And I just want to remind everyone that we can use the raise hand feature in the Zoom if you, so that we can track the order of questions, if that's possible. Are there any more clarifying questions for Dr. Allen?
Yes, just a quick clarifying question on your slide 17. You have a table where you show a bunch of different formulations. Would be curious to know.
The eye irritation testing.
Yes, can you just clarify a bit like what you knew about them and like kind of general context about
those are agrochemical formulations where we knew the active ingredient and we knew percentage-wise. I think we had percent surfactant in the formulation where relevant, and we also knew the surfactant type. But we didn't know anything really about the quantitative formula itself.
Okay. If there's no more clarifying questions, we'll move on. Thank you so much, Dr. Allen. And I'd like to take this opportunity to have Dr. Baines introduce himself, please.
Good morning, everybody. I want to apologize for my tardiness. I had a few school bus driver issues this morning. I'm sure you can relate to that. Again, my name is Antonio Baines. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Biological and Biomedical Sciences at North Carolina Central University. I'm also an adjunct associate professor in the Department of Pharmacology and also a member in the curriculum in toxicology and environmental medicine at UNC Chapel Hill. I study pancreatic cancer, and I'm also on Cicada. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Okay, we are going to move to the opening remarks, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Wojcik to provide those, please.
Okay, sorry for you're kind of butting in. I didn't realize that the meeting had already started. So let me just start by saying I want to welcome everyone here to the 2023 meeting of the Scientific Advisory Committee on Alternate Toxicological Methods, or of course we all refer to this as SACADM. So you should be aware that the SACADM is a federally chartered external advisory group of scientists. And these scientists are from both the public and the private sectors. And it includes, SACADM includes representatives from the regulated industry and national animal protection organizations. So each year we look to SACADM for advice regarding the mandated duties of ICFAM and the activities of NICETA. So this year's agenda is packed. You've probably already seen it. Again, I apologize for my delay. I was actually in the Institute and Center Directors meeting that just adjourned. So you will be hearing over the course of the next couple of days, updates in several different areas associated with the development, the evaluation, and the implementation of new approach methodologies, or These have come to be referred, as you all know, as NAMs. So first, there will be presentations relating to progress on the implementation of the recommendations of the ICFAM strategic roadmap. And specifically, you will be hearing about replacement of acute toxicity tests. And the little bit that I just heard, I think we heard just a little bit about that. So also you will hear about planned next steps and the future priorities. So in addition, there will be presentations about the extensive efforts ongoing across the globe. It's not just the United States, but across the globe to update approaches for establishing confidence in NAMs. I mean, the previous guidance is more than 20 years old, so clearly it was time to revisit these approaches. So robust feedback was provided during a public comment period on the ICFAM report on validation, qualification, and regulatory acceptance of new approach methodologies. So it will be useful to get feedback from SCATM on this, feedback from SCATM on this feedback that we've received. So ICFAM has been very active in exploring the role of new approach methodologies in improving environmental health protection. I think one of the most critical and exciting opportunities is how to use NAMs to address variability, the biological and genetic variability that exists across populations. So we'll hear about the recent NICEM workshop, NICEM workshop to address this topic, along with specific efforts within the U.S. government and as well as academic organizations to address, again, this biological, genetic, and epigenetic variability. So we'll also learn about interagency efforts to address contaminants of concern, for example, like PFAS chemicals. So finally, we'll hear about several updates to the computational resources developed and maintained by the NICEM team. So these are tools that will be available to any and all ICFAM stakeholders. So we look forward to your insightful comments and the feedback on these important issues. Your discussion and comments are always critical to the ICFAM process. Now, in addition to today's feedback, I thought I would take the opportunity to let you know that the NIH Common Fund is requesting input on the development of a new potential Common Fund project. It's entitled Complement Animal Research in Experimentation. And it's actually abbreviated Complement, AIRI, and it's pronounced complementary. So this will be a new program aimed at the development, standardization, validation, and the use of NAMs. There are 3 listening sessions that will be held on October 2nd, October 16th, and the 30th. So if you're interested, and I suspect many of you may be interested, registration information can be found on the NIEHS events page. So after a few years of participation by Zoom, it's good that most of you are there in person. So we greatly appreciate the efforts that you've made to travel, and in some cases, very long distances, to come to Research Triangle Park. So I'm just sorry that I had commitments today, including the IC Directors Meeting, which happened several floors up here in Building 31 in Bethesda. So I can't be there in person, but I'm disappointed. But nevertheless, the rest of you are, and so I'm very encouraged that you can have this high quality in-person meeting. So I'd like to recognize the extensive efforts and contributions of 2 SCATM members. So I'm doing this because their terms of service will come to an end this year. So they are Denise Forsch from Earth Bio, and Tamara Tal from the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research. So thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge the continued collaborations with our international partners from CATM and from the OECD. So they provide technical expertise and work to ensure that we are fostering international harmonization. It's absolutely critical. We've got to be working across global boundaries. So with those introductory remarks, sorry that I can't be there in person. And again, welcome. I'll turn the chair back over to Dr. Page. So please have a great meeting. And thanks again for this opportunity to provide some introductory remarks.
And thank you, Dr. Sills, for presenting the certificates to our SCATM members that are rotating off. At this time, I would like to welcome Dr. Perron to provide her talk, please.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Monique Perrin. I'm the Senior Science Advisor at the EPA's Office of Pesticide Programs, and I have the pleasure of giving you an overview of the work that's been going on at the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention. There's actually many people in the room that have been more deeply involved than I have in several of these projects, but I get the pleasure of telling you all about them, and I get the benefit of going after Dave, who has already talked about most of these at some level, but hopefully I can give a little bit of a different perspective on a couple of things. And this is just our typical government disclaimer slide that this has been reviewed and approved in accordance with EPA, and any mention of trade names, products, et cetera, is not endorsement by the US government. So for those of you who are maybe not familiar with the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, there's two programs that are responsible for looking at the risk of chemicals. We do have a third program, the Office of Program Support, that third office, I should say, that supports these programs. But the Office of Pesticide Programs regulates the manufacture and use. Okay, I think there's like a timer on this, sorry. Regulates the manufacture and use of all pesticides and establishes maximum levels of pesticide residues in food. Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics regulates new chemicals and existing chemicals, so more industrial type chemicals. So our efforts to reduce and replace vertebrate animal testing are tied to a NAM work plan that we developed in 2020 and further updated in 2021. It describes 5 objectives and strategies for the development and implementation of new approach methods, as well as in previous years, the Office of Pesticide Programs has, I'm sorry, that might happen quite often. Apparently there's some timer on my slides that I don't know about. So we've published several guidance documents that really outline the focus on going after data that's actually going to be impactful for our risk assessment. So going away from this checkbox approach and moving towards actually looking at all of the available data and looking at, whether or not additional data are going to be impactful for our risk assessment. OPPT also has a strategic plan that was developed to incorporate NAMs, which provide information, that the NAMs have to provide information that's equivalent or of better scientific quality and relevance for assessing risk. So what you'll see throughout this presentation is some of these projects are, were developed either first in OPP or in OPPT. Several of them kind of go across. Some of these are project specific. So the two programs differ in one significant way in terms of pesticides were very data rich. We're on the industrial chemical side, not as much. So we have different challenges and also different statutory obligations. So I'm going to run through similar to Dave, and I did them in the same order as well for the acute 6-pack. So starting with the dermal waiver, because that's the easier one. I think a lot of the time we start with the acute oral, but when we could get into this space, it's easier to talk about the fact that we've had for several years now guidance for dermal waivers. It was first developed for pesticide formulations in 2016 and then expanded to active ingredients in 2020. I won't get into CATMOS because, again, Dave gave a lot more information than I had planned to, but ultimately we have been greatly involved in this project, especially this sort of started more for our scientists in the ecological realm, but then also it was acknowledged that, well, this is actually going to be really helpful also for our labeling and classification needs as well. So this has been seen to be very promising for the non-toxic chemicals, those with LD50 greater than 2,000, and the analysis and conclusions from the work is getting ready for publication in the very near future. And this is one thing Dave quickly glossed over towards the end of his presentation. We've also had a recent publication on the use of the GHS mixture equation for formulations. We had started off with a pilot program where people could send in the animal data, but also use the GHS equation in their submissions. So we did these paired submissions. We had 5 companies submit data through that pilot program. We also had 3 companies submit data directly to NICEDM. So we had quite a large data set for this, over 600 agrochemicals and about 50 antimicrobial cleaning products. And all of this has been summarized in Ham et al. 2021. And what we saw was, for the category 1 side of things or the category 4, some pretty good concordance, and then in the middle, which this often seems to happen when you start to do these concordance analysis, trying to get into teasing out those middle categories. And this data set was predominantly those with category 3 or category 4 classifications to begin with. So not really, so there was a supplemental analysis that looked at, well, if we grouped all of those non-toxic classifications into one group, how did that impact things, and it actually increased improved the concordance of the predictions. So where is this coming in with respect to our submissions and our application within the agency? So we're starting to see the GHS equation be part of weight of evidence submissions. So it's often included in addition to some other in vivo data that's already available for the chemicals. So it has been included in our submissions. We have told registrants, that we will consider the GHS mixtures equation as part of our evaluation on whether or not they can waive the study. So it's already getting incorporated into our considerations. Acute inhalation, I think, is one where it's kind of dragging behind in the 6-pack realm. It's been a bit more challenging. We do have some waiver guidance more related to the physical chemical properties, and sort of aligns with the OECD information, but this is one space where I think we're trying to see, can we extend some of the applications that we did for oral? So similar, can we do something like Catmos for inhalation, like Dave had explained? We did do a pilot for the GHS mixtures equation where people could do paired for acute inhalation as well. Not as many submissions came in for that. So we're digging into that to see, again, is it possible that we could do these similar approaches there as well? There are some ongoing investigations also in continuing to utilize the in vitro assays. Sort of been getting some mixed results in that space, based off of what I've seen at different conferences and poster presentations, but it's still something that we continue to look into. And then we've been collaborating on an in-depth review of the species differences. So we've definitely seen in the NAM space that the more we can anchor things to a biological understanding, the more robust support we have for that. And also it helps with our communication out to the public to get different stakeholders to be supportive. Eye irritation and the Office of Pesticide Programs, we do have a framework for eye irritation for antimicrobial cleaning products. These are typically submitted for homeowner use type products. We do consider this on a case-by-case for other pesticide classes, and we have also had paired submissions for this as well. In addition, we have been, and this slide should say being prepared for submission. I'm sorry that there's a manuscript that's very close to being submitted for 2 defined approaches for agrochemicals. And again, this was covered by Dave, where we looked at 29 agrochemical formulations and tried to leverage the test guideline assays that are already available and have been adopted. And then for on the Office of Pesticide and Pollution and Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxic side. Submitters of new chemical notices or exemptions are required to report existing available data to support their submission. This can be a wide range of different data, so they've developed this decision framework to sort of provide a transparent way to show how they're making their decisions, whether that be that they can make a decision or do we need more information. So that's ultimately where this decision framework has come into play, as how can we look at the different lines of evidence. So again, Dave had presented this in his slides, but ultimately it's a very mapped out way to show stakeholders how we're making our decisions. And then on the skin irritation side, similarly, we're looking at how can we leverage those test guidelines that are already available. In OPP, we have some proposed testing strategies that are utilizing these test guidelines, as well as some additional assays to aid in identifying not only whether it's an irritant and whether it's not an irritant, but also can we tease out the mild irritants in between. There is a manuscript being prepared right now for submission on that. It also, again, dives into the biological understanding. And then for OPPT and their new chemicals program, they're currently developing a decision framework to assess skin irritation hazard when there's multiple lines of evidence that exist. And then lastly, in dermal sensitization, since 2018, we've had an interim policy accepting the defined approaches that were sort of the interim defined approaches in the work that was going on for OECD at the time. And then in 2021, the test guideline for 497 was adopted. And so we do try to keep track of these different submissions. For OPP, we've already been tracking this on our website. For OPPT, they're still developing their metrics, and we hope that in the next year we'll be seeing that also publicly available. But ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, the NAMs still represent a small portion of the data that's submitted to both of our programs right now. We usually get hundreds of applications per year, and as you can see, in total over the past 5 years, each program's gotten somewhere between, well, a couple of those were a little low, but close to around 100 over the past 5 years for each. And then just wanted to mention also for OPP, over the past few years, we've also aimed to track anything associated with different type of guidance. So like our dermal waiver guidance, for example, we've also tried to follow, how many of those waivers have been granted. So again, as we keep on moving through and developing different guidance documents and having different applications for NAMs, we're trying our best to track them so we can see the impact for our program. We do have a committee called the Chemistry and Acute Toxicology Science Advisory Council, or CATSAC, that we historically have sort of followed to say, well, how many waivers have you been providing per year? But now, as more and more of these submissions are coming in, they've started to actually make some of these decisions if they're very straightforward within the branches. So we've been starting to sort of go back and make sure that we're getting everything, tracking everything. So no process is perfect, of course, and we're still figuring everything out. We want to be able to accurately depict what's been going on in the program. So before I get into some of the challenges, I just wanted to kind of also say a lot of the success coming out of all of this has been through our collaborations. Again, going back to the strategic roadmap, like thinking about the end user, like what is the question that we need to answer? Is the NAM going to answer our regulatory need? And so I did not do a very good job along the way of giving credit to all of the different people and groups that have been involved, but it's been a Herculean effort for a lot of these things. But some of the challenges, so providing policy and guidance documents, this is such a government type of challenge. You know, we move slow, we have small, you know, short on resources. Then there's also the problem of by the time we come out with a policy or guidance document, 5 more things have changed since then, and how do you make it flexible enough to include that evolution? So we're trying to think of ways internally that we can start to move these along faster so that we can jump over some of those hurdles. Consistency across the 2 programs whenever possible. As I mentioned, some things might not be applicable because of our different regulations or the different chemical space that we're trying to work with, but as much as possible, we want to be consistent. We do have a new policy council now that we can send documents through, which has representatives from both OPP and OPPT. So hopefully that'll also help with that consistency. International harmonization, I think this is what I've heard quite a lot from stakeholders is that, well, we could do the NAM for you, but we still have to do the animal for another country anyways. So we're just going to do the animal study. So I think that's, you know, continuing to push in the international forums to try to make sure that, you know, we can try to avoid that situation as much as possible would be great. And then lastly, I kind of touched on it already, but the coverage of the relevant chemical space. So something that's developed and formed only using pesticide chemicals, we then need to, you know, see if it's going to be applicable or relevant in the industrial space and vice versa. So I think that's my last slide. Oh, I just have a quick summary slide, but I think I might be over time, so I'm just going to leave that up. Oh, okay, I'm getting the go ahead. So we do. So, and I didn't mention this earlier as well. OPP has flexibility in our data requirements that allows for the waivers and alternative approaches, which is why many of these are incredibly, you know, easy in terms of some other regulatory organization, in comparison to some other regulatory organizations for us to consider and implement into our risk assessments and evaluations. On the OPPT side, they actually have a statutory mandate to consider the availability of NAMs that are equal to or better than the animal study. So both offices are continuing to progress and work on adopting, you know, NAMs annually. We're tracking that as well. As we develop our guidance documents, you know, we're going to keep on tracking that as well. And lastly, as I mentioned, collaboration is key. We've been working on numerous national and international organizations and with stakeholders on continuing development and implementation of NAMs for acute toxicity as well as other toxic effects. So that should be my last slide.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Perron. At this time, I'd like to ask if there is any clarifying questions from any of the SACATA members. And if we can please use the raise hand feature in Zoom. Everybody should be logged into the Zoom. Okay, perfect. And you have been doing that. Dr. Tal?
Thanks for the very nice presentation. I think it's great how you're tracking submission numbers and making that publicly available. Do you also track the success rates between submissions that include NAMs and those that use traditional methods, like in terms of overall success rate and also time to acceptance?
We have not done that, no, in terms of following the amount of time, no. I mean, because there's so many different aspects too that go into, you know, the approval. At least I can talk towards the OPP side. You know, there's a timeline to do the full risk assessment, you know, if a new use or a new active ingredient comes in. So we have a certain amount of time depending on what type of submission it is. So the acutes are, you know, a little bit quicker, and they're actually done probably usually towards the front end of the review, but then there's so many other things. So it would be a little difficult to be able to track it if it's not the only thing being looked at. You know.
Okay, Dr. Marty?
I thought the presentation was great as well. My question is around CATMOS. I think CATMOS is an amazing achievement, but it's really, the acute oral toxicity data sets are very unbalanced. And so I've heard reference twice now to it being used to identify non-toxic acute oral compounds. Can you speak to its utility for ones that might have toxicity, so category 1s and 2s, and how we're managing those?
So I mean, I will actually say again, there's people in the room that will probably be able to answer this question much better than I. But I will say that we have not implemented this yet. So, we haven't figured out from a program standpoint exactly how we're going to utilize it. So, it does seem like the promise is that if you are going in the non-toxic realm, this is where we think definitely it has the ability to be a replacement. On the toxic side, it might depend on what the other information is that's available. I can see it as, maybe, coupling it with other lines of evidence to try to figure out, could it then support? So I think it's going to take a little time to figure out where on the other side of the spectrum, how we do that, what other lines of evidence are we going to consider there? So I think there's a little bit of figuring that piece out. But I think on the non-toxic side is where we're seeing a lot of support that this is going to be promising in that respect.
And Dr. Berg.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Great presentation. I have a question about your NAMS metrics tracking. Do you have more detail on what's behind those numbers? Are certain organizations coming back? Is it representative of are the people who are the groups who are doing these methods diverse, representative of everybody who's submitting approvals, that sort of detail?
Sure. So we haven't tracked that per se, but I would probably say that definitely the larger companies are going to be more of that representation. But we do bring this up during pre-registration meetings, at least on the pesticide side, to the smaller companies as well, that there are options and to look into them. So there is that aspect. But in terms of what goes into the numbers, we're usually looking at, how many are there. We do an estimate of how many animals are saved, and we do an estimate of cost for the study. I will say those are likely underestimates because they're looking directly only at the study. So if there were any other studies involved to get to that point, so I mean, this is more relevant for repeat dosing studies where we also track similarly our waivers on that side. Range finding studies are not considered and things like that.
Thank you. And we are restricting clarifying questions to SCATM members at this time. Yeah, and okay, so it does not look like we have any SCATM members that have clarifying questions. So at this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Kleinstreyer to please provide her presentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chair. So I'm going to talk to you very sort of briefly about where do we go from here. So you've had a really, really nice overview from both Dave and Monique from sort of the research side, supporting regulatory application and decision making, and then from our regulatory partners giving us insight into the ways in which they've tried to incorporate some of these new approach methodologies into their regulatory decisions and the guidance that they put out towards regulated industry. And so my job today is to talk to you about how do we actually achieve full implementation of replacement of the six-pack with new approach methodologies, and then where do we go beyond the six-pack. So I'm going to start with the concept of implementation, because I think in large part, so there's this saying, I'll probably butcher it, but it's something like the last 20% of a project takes 80% of the effort, right? So we, I would say, are 80% of the way there in terms of getting to full replacement of the acute tox six-pack. I think most of the scientific work has really been done. We have excellent in vitro platforms that are based on human cells and human molecular signals. We have some great computational models that provide very comprehensive coverage across the chemical universe and provide robust and reliable predictions for endpoints like acute oral systemic toxicity. We're working on acute inhalation systemic toxicity using that same type of computational modeling approach. And so the science is almost there, but we can't stop with the science, because if we develop new methods, even if we validate new methods for regulatory use, if we don't work with our regulatory partners to actually implement those methods into guidance, if we don't communicate that guidance to our stakeholders in regulated industry, not just within the US, but internationally, then we will never get to 100%. We will never get to actual implementation and uptake and acceptance of new approach methods for the six-pack. And we've heard from EPA's Office of Pesticide Programs about their commitment to this goal. This actually began back in 2016 with this, well, it didn't begin there, but it was sort of formalized in this letter to stakeholders from the one of the higher ups in the EPA at that time about sort of the immediate goal for OPP, and this is 7 years ago, to significantly reduce or ultimately even replace the use of animals in the six-pack. And so we've been working very diligently toward that goal for the last 7+ years. But again, we need to move it into actual acceptance and implementation through the use of guidance and policy documents. And that's within and across agencies. So it's not just up to the EPA. The EPA is obviously one of the leaders in this space, has demonstrated a very high degree of commitment towards putting out these guidance and policy documents. But there are other agencies that rely on acute toxicity data to make regulatory decisions. So the FDA gets acute toxicity data as part of their submission packages. The Consumer Product Safety Commission considers acute toxicity data in their post-market surveillance. Agencies worldwide that follow the OECD test guidelines program rely on acute toxicity data, both topical toxicity and systemic toxicity endpoints, to make lots of different regulatory decisions in both the human health risk assessment space and also the ecological risk assessment space. It's often used as a surrogate for lots of other species. So looking at toxicity to mammals is used as a surrogate to make decisions around ecological risk assessment. And so I think it cannot be overstated the importance of public-private partnerships in this space to partner with our regulated industry colleagues to ensure that they understand that regulatory authorities are not only willing to consider, but actually eager to receive data that uses new approach methodologies as part of their submission packages. And so that companies that are multinational, global conglomerates aren't just going to the lowest common denominator and saying, okay, we're just going to do the animal test because we know that that's accepted, by most regions in the world, but actually communicating to them that in fact the non-animal methods are preferred by many regulatory agencies worldwide. And to do that, I think it's very important for us to partner with our colleagues at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So using things like the IATA case studies program, so the Integrated Approaches to Testing and Assessments case studies program, to develop exemplar case studies that demonstrate how you can use new approach methodologies to provide the level of information that's needed for robust regulatory decision making, and then transition those into actual internationally harmonized codified test guidelines, or in most cases, defined approach guidelines. The skin sensitization defined approach guideline is an excellent example. We have defined approaches for eye irritation, for skin irritation coming down the pipeline, but getting to all of the six-pack endpoints. So developing defined approaches for predicting acute oral systemic toxicity, acute inhalation systemic toxicity, and actually getting those solidified into OECD test guidelines to ensure that worldwide we will get consideration and acceptance acceptance of these new approach methods for these acute tox endpoints. And then I think another extremely important piece is socializing this message, is distributing this message. Because within companies, I'm often told over and over again by our industry partners that there are champions of new approach methods within companies in the toxicology division, scientists who say, listen, this is a more human relevant, more reliable approach to protecting public health to go with these human-based new approach methodologies, but their lawyers say, I don't want to hear it because we know that authorities will accept the animal studies, and so we would rather not waste money on doing human relevant or human-based new approach methodologies when we feel like we're in a safe space with doing the animal studies and submitting that data. And so we've seen our NGO partners step up dramatically in the space of developing education and training programs. So we have the new approach methodologies used in regulatory application, or the NURA training program. It's been developed by PCRM. There is a training program that's under development by the American Chemistry Council right now. So there's a number of different consortiums that are really trying to develop materials that can be widely disseminated to educate industry and regulators alike about the availability of new approach methodologies and the fact that they really represent an evolution in science to using human-based methods in a way that's more protective of public health. Okay, so the other thing that I think we really need to focus on is extending beyond single chemicals. So most of the methods that Dave and Monique have talked to you about today have really been robustly validated, and their reliability has been demonstrated in the space of monoconstituent, well-defined substances. But the vast majority of six-pack data is actually generated on formulation products. And so we need to get to a space where we can actually apply these new approach methodologies to formulation products and to other types of complex mixtures like medical device extracts, for example. So the FDA relies on topical toxicity information for like skin irritation, eye irritation, skin sensitization for medical device extracts, but they are not currently accepting a lot of these new approach methodologies because those methods have not been validated in the space of chemistry that they care about. And so working together with our regulatory partners and with industry to develop consortiums to share data in a way that is transparent and gives us large enough data sets that we can establish confidence for federal agencies' contexts of use and the chemical spaces that they regulate is absolutely critical. And there is a lot of evidence that we can actually use things like the GHS additivity approach to predict these endpoints for formulation products. So if you know what each of the ingredients are and you can either predict or you have data for each of those co-formulants, each of those ingredients, then you can simply use a weighted sum approach to predict that endpoint for that formulated product. And there's a number of publications, not only from our group, but from other groups, like from our colleagues at the Department of Defense, that show that you can very reliably use these new approach methodologies with this weighted additivity approach to predict those endpoints for mixtures. And so developing more case studies in that area and then trying to sort of formalize that in regulatory guidance documents and ultimately in test guidelines and demonstrating the application not only to single chemicals but to formulation products will get us that much closer to full replacement of the six-pack across sort of the universe of substances that it applies to. Okay, so once we do that, apply that 80% of effort to that additional 20% that's needed to sort of close out that, where do we go from here? So when we are thinking about future directions for NICEDM and ICFAM, we're always planning many, many years in the future. So we're thinking, okay, where will we be not just next year, but 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? How do we effectively put in place strategic roadmaps and plans to make sure that we are addressing agency needs, particularly our regulatory partner needs, and ensuring the best science is being used for optimal environmental health and public health protection? You'll hear to a large extent later today about the ICFAM validation workgroup report. This is a document that's a little bit of a spoiler alert that we've been working on for a couple years with input from all of our agency partners, and I think it really provides a nice framework for how you need to go, what you need to think about when you're validating and qualifying new approach methods for regulatory use. And one of the most important aspects of that document is defining agency and endpoint specific contexts of use, and then developing flexible fit-for-purpose validation strategies that are tailored to those contexts of use. And so for us, as we're thinking about strategic planning for NICEDM and ICFAM, we need to understand what are those agency needs, what are those agency decision frameworks and contexts of use, so that we can prioritize development of new approach methodologies and validation of those NAMs accordingly. We are obviously already have pretty extensive programs focused on more complex endpoints. So we sort of started with the acute tox battery because it was low-hanging fruit and because the science was very well developed, and the new approach methods were pretty much already there, and it required some additional testing strategy development and validation. But now, as we're sort of trying to close that portion out, we want to look into the future and say, how can we start to develop and validate and establish confidence in human-based approaches for complex, chronic endpoints like cancer, like cardiotoxicity, like developmental neurotoxicity, like reproductive toxicity. And we're extremely fortunate to be housed within the Division of Translational Toxicology here at NIEHS, where there are incredibly strong programs already ongoing in the DNT space, the cardiotoxicity space, and the carcinogenicity space. So we have these health effect innovation programs that NICEDM is fully integrated with, and so we're working very closely with our partners here at DTT to identify new approach methods that are human-based, that give us mechanistic information and allow us to look at large numbers of chemicals and understand how they could potentially be affecting mechanisms of these critical types of endpoints like cancer and cardiovascular tox and systemic toxicity. And then, as Dr. Wojcik pointed out in his welcoming remarks, I think one of the most exciting potential applications of human-based NAMs is their ability to represent population variability and susceptibility. So just as we are not 200-pound rats, we are also not the same as one another. So there are extremely heterogeneous responses across the population, not only to pharmaceuticals, but also to environmental exposures. There's factors such as genetic predisposition to susceptibility, comorbidities, epigenetic factors, lifestyle factors, environmental co-exposures that have a dramatic influence on how people respond to exposure to toxicants or to drugs. And so using human-based approaches to represent that variability and susceptibility across the population is a responsibility that we have if we're really trying to use the best human-based science to improve environmental health sciences. And so we have a sort of burgeoning effort in that space that you'll hear about tomorrow. We're also trying to constantly adapt and use sort of all of the tools in our computational toolbox, including artificial intelligence, large language models, and in particular, probabilistic approaches to improving next generation risk assessment. And this goes hand in hand with looking at responses across a population. So how do you develop probabilistic models that give you sort of an idea with quantification of uncertainty how populations might respond to environmental exposures, and then allow you to actually protect for the most sensitive and susceptible among those populations. And then something else you'll hear about tomorrow is sort of emerging efforts to try and develop a coordinated rapid response plan across the federal government. So the National Toxicology Program, DTT, and NICEDM are all very engaged with other federal agencies to try and understand how can we use NAMs, how can we use human relevant science in a very rapid and responsive way when there are things like the East Palestine train derailment, and we know that there's exposure to these populations of environmental chemicals that could potentially be toxic. One specific example of sort of a new direction that we're heading in and a topic that has been indicated to us that's a high priority for a wide range of federal agencies, including the FDA, the EPA, the CPSC, and the Department of Defense, is understanding gastrointestinal tract toxicity. And that sort of covers the entire range of being able to de-risk chemicals for systemic toxicity. So if you're exposed to compounds through an oral route, are those compounds actually going to get into systemic circulation, or are they just going to be metabolized and excreted through your GI tract? Could they potentially exert direct toxicity on the GI tract, including effects on the microbiome, or could they potentially cause allergenic effects? And so we have a series of webinars. The first two already happened earlier this week. The next one is in early October, and then we have a workshop planned in person in Bethesda in October 11th and 12th. To explore the state of the science for NAMs for this important endpoint that's highly relevant to other systemic toxicity effects. So that's just a sort of a preview of one of the areas in which we're going sort of beyond the acute toxicity six-pack. So you've already seen this slide, but I do need to take a minute and say that I'm incredibly privileged to be leading this amazing group. And I also just want to take a very quick moment to recognize Dr. Judy Strickland, who has been contributing as a senior scientist to NICEDM and ICFAM for 20 years. She's been with us essentially since the inception of ICFAM, and she has led so many of our acute toxicity efforts, and we would never be where we are today without her tremendous contributions. So, and she's retiring. That's why she's retiring next week. It's her last day. So I just want to give a special thank you to her. Okay, thanks very much. I'll take any clarifying questions.
Thank you. And we'll open it up to clarifying questions from SACATA members, please. And again, just please use the raise hand feature in the Zoom. Does not appear that we have any. So thank you, Dr. Kleinstreyer.
Thank you very much.
And now we're going to move on to the public comment portion for this first part of the session. So as was mentioned previously, public comments were solicited through the Federal Register notice, and written comments were posted to the meeting webpage and distributed to SACATA members in advance of the meeting. And we did receive 2 written comments for this session. Individuals requesting to make oral comments were required to register in advance in order for us to plan for that. And we have received 2 oral comments for this session. And I would like to welcome the first oral presenter, who is Amy Klippinger. Yeah. Okay, so Amy is requested to go at the end of the day and combine her comments. So I'd like to welcome our other oral presenter, which will be Elizabeth Baker.
All right, thank you. I've scribbled some notes down while we were in all the presentations, so hopefully they can help guide me here. First, I want to say thanks to SACADM, to the ICFAM reps and agencies, NICEDM, the contractors. There's just so much great work that is happening, and yet there's so much to do still. These meetings are so great because we get to celebrate the progress that's being made. We get to learn from each other, receive input. There's awesome exchange of ideas. I was struck that FDA isn't presenting, and if I recall correctly, I don't think CEDAR was at the ICFAM public forum either. And I think it's really important to be able to hear what is going on and what these agencies are doing. So I would encourage SACADM to, I'm not exactly sure what role you could take, but if you can do what you can to encourage the ICFAM agencies that haven't been participating publicly to do so. For the six-pack, I was really glad to see that full replacement of the six-pack is a theme. I think there's been so much effort put in, and it's got to remain a priority so we can get to full replacement. Just a reminder, our NGO, I think others in this room and online, we share this goal and we have resources, we have human power. So please continue to engage with us. And if there are certain needs, let us know and let us see what we can come up with to support the awesome work that you all are doing. Policy. Policy is so important. As we heard from the speakers today, and I think we hear at many of these meetings, it's not just about great science. It's also about getting that great science into practice, and updating policies is a really important part of that. So the request of SACADM is to really encourage the ICFAM representatives to lead efforts within their own agencies. There are, I think some agencies value policy updates more than others, but I think there's just a lot of opportunity within multiple agencies to do so. And then I guess I'll just finish up with saying, I was really wowed and impressed with Dr. Kleinsteuer's presentation, and I think that her vision for getting us to full replacement of the six-pack and then for what's next really just demonstrates her passion for great science and shows that we've got the right person in leadership there. Thank you all.
Thank you. Okay, so we're now in the SACADM discussion portion. So we had a little bit about how this works, but I'm just going to remind everybody. So each SACADM member has been assigned to discussion questions throughout the course of this meeting. And we're going to ask the lead discussants to provide their comments first, and then open it up to other SACADM members who are also all welcome to comment. So for this session, the full replacement of the acute toxicity six-pack, the lead discussants assigned were Dr. Leary, Dr. Sura, and Dr. Miles. So if you can provide the raise hand, use the raise hand feature to dictate order, and we will go.
Good morning, everyone. This is Priyanka. I'll go first. Regarding the thoughts and strategies to fulfill the complete replacement of all 6 endpoints, as we've heard today, the acute six-packs are primarily used for hazard classification and labeling. Sorry. Better? Okay. So as we heard today, the acute six-packs are primarily used for hazard classification and labeling. Completing the six-pack requires, as we heard through the presentations, 50 laboratory animals for each formulation or the active ingredient. One of the things that and Nicole mentioned it elegantly, like regulatory agencies definitely need to update their guidances such that its recommendations not only reduce the number of studies which are conducted, but also provide the recommendations for the appropriate NAMs that can replace these studies. Because I think larger companies are following suit, but there's a lot of information, and again, this has been mentioned in the common thread today, that folks feel that if they put in the NAMs, there's a possibility that their registrations might not get accepted, and they don't have the luxury of time to wait it out. So that's one thing that has to be put out there, that the agencies are actually looking for folks to do these alternate testing. And another thing I noticed was, like, especially at the OPP and OPPTS, they're doing a wonderful job by actually putting it out there and granting waivers and looking at alternates, but that's not the thread across agencies. Even within agencies, there's a lot of differences, and people don't, I don't want to say folks don't understand, but they are aware of it, but they're not really sure how it can be used as a 1:1 replacement. Additionally, for the acute test, we have all these in silico models, such as the CATMOS, which can be used for acute oral toxicity, and they have good results. So why it should be something which should be thought about into building it into the regulatory framework. Again, there's a lack of guidance on how to perform and document these in silico analysis, because in tandem with the in vitro analysis, I think they would go a long way. So using it as a complement to both of the things going together. And the current in vitro models I've seen like the in vitro skin and eye irritation, they don't really provide all the GHS categorization that is needed by agencies such as the Department of Transportation, which is something like, at least from the pharmaceutical side, where there's not a lot of data out there, people are toying with what should I do next. And that's when I would think the in silico models would be really handy, and if that's built into the guidance, whereas not defaulting to the animal studies. Another approach would be to develop or rather adopt a fit-for-purpose approach to meet the regulatory agency's requirements. I understand each regulatory agency has a different set of requirements. So if we have NAMs which are addressing that specific requirement that that agency might require, that would be really helpful and relevant. Moving to the second question, what are your thoughts on areas that should be prioritized in the future? First and foremost, it should be the adoption of the NAMs should be kind of across industries. It should not be limited just to the chemical center. It should be like across the breadth, like pharmaceuticals too. They definitely use these testing extensively. And also, we should encourage the agencies, and I've seen like OPPS and others are doing it, but at the same time, we should collect and keep records of these tests and where they are used, and so that the metrics are definitely important, and and basically document the success rates. And again, I've seen that there's a common thread across certain agencies in their willingness to consider alternates and make recommendations. So that should be something which should be widely communicated, that the agencies are open and can serve as a potential resource to guide the testing plans, because I don't think the smaller companies are aware of that option. It's almost like they go and do the check the box exercise and that be done with it. The next question about what's next, the low-hanging fruit for strategies. Like I mentioned before, the refinement of the in vitro tests, especially for the skin and eye irritation, because just the BCOF, for example, if you do an assay, there's like, you have these below 3 output which reads out as no category, and then 3 to 55 would say we cannot classify it, and then above 55 it goes into a categorization. So further refinement in that would be really helpful, without like saying that if you're falling in that area, you basically have to do additional testing, and that typically interprets in, okay, and that's not going to give me a ready answer, might as well do an animal test, unless I'm driven by my submission, wherever I'm submitting my information. Last is what can be done to ensure harmonization and regulatory guidance on the acute tox six-pack among EQUAM agencies and international organizations. Again, Nicole has touched on it, so just to reiterate, the development and implementation within the regulatory agencies, it definitely relies heavily on the collaboration with a variety of stakeholders, communication, and making sure that even within organization, folks are communicating and actually looking at options and ways to actually implement the NAMs which are being developed. And again, developing metrics is definitely important for assessing the progress. That's all I had. Thank you.
Dr. Miles or Dr. Leary, if you want to proceed.
Thank you very much. And thank you for those comments. That was very helpful. Well, I will say that after listening to Dr. Kleinster, there's really good leadership here, and I think that you're certainly alert to all the opportunities. I do want to just go back to the time when the strategic roadmap came out and what a game changer it was. And certainly it was a significant publication, and it represented this moment of consensus between the different ICVAM member agencies, which was very important. I think it's very important to continue the engagement of all the agencies. As Dr. Sura just pointed out, of Department of Transportation, which is not the EPA, doesn't put those kind of resources into a research department. You know, if they have that requirement, that's sort of dictating what some of the animal tests might be. So I think communication was certainly one of the priorities identified in the roadmap, and it continues to be one of the issues that I think could make a real difference in getting to complete replacement of the six-pack and implementing other NAMs. The models have definitely advanced in the last 5 years, remarkably so. There have been huge efforts in generating some very key data and building scientific confidence. There's been a lot of international activity. Dr. Perrin talked about some of the challenges, and I think a big challenge is that we have some great alternative methods, but they're not being used, and the animals are being used. So I think that the metrics are, I know we had a working group on metrics, and it was a little unsatisfying because they sort of came to the conclusion that each agency is going to have to do their own. But we really haven't heard from the individual ICFAM agencies about how they're going to do metrics, except a little bit from EPA, which has made a terrific effort, at least with OPP. But I think turning the ship around is a difficult task. So I think that without the metrics, we don't have the transparency that we need to really focus on the replacement. So this is all, again, about this communications piece. We need clear communications to stakeholders. One thing that might help the agencies is that decision tree template, maybe that each agency could adapt for their own purposes, fit for purpose. We need more regulatory guidance. As Dr. Sura pointed out, some of the smaller companies it's just not getting through to them. And unfortunately, a waiver is not a clear endorsement. We need more specific guidance. So I think that funding might help in that regard. I think funding communications, there's a lot of talk about funding science and research into the alternatives, but I think the funding for communications could definitely be more robust. And then you wouldn't need to rely so much on, smaller private organizations for the training. I think that we want to create a sort of atmosphere where folks have a fear of missing out if they're not part of this. There has been a lot of great communication, I know, at some of the conferences. NICEDM has a really strong presence at some of the conferences I see. But we shouldn't have to rely on champions within agencies and within companies. It should be the default to use NAMs because the science is so impressive right now. I do absolutely agree that focusing on OECD and the international harmonization is a great place to set a priority. And just a fun little suggestion, if agencies might have helplines for those folks who are a little stumped and say, I see all this stuff, but I don't think it applies to me. Instead of going to your agency contact, who's going to be the one approving your submission, maybe a little helpline. So just a thought, kind of a fun thing. Thanks.
Thank you. I would like to open it up now to have any other SICATM members or ad hoc members to contribute to the discussion. And please use the raise hand feature so that we know the orders. Dr. Berg.
Hi. So areas that should be prioritized, the NAMS metrics, I'm not impressed. You need to dig into that data and figure out why we're not growing the adoption over 5 years of these methods. That will tell us what to fix, probably. So that's my 2 cents.
So first of all, I just want to congratulate everyone on the progress. It's really amazing, everything going on with the six-pack, and that it's at the point we're actually talking about public-private partnerships and actually to how to implement it. So I think like it's important to remember, just because something works doesn't mean people are going to use it. And I think this is, exactly what you were getting at. I think a lot about like technical feasibility, commercial viability, user uptake, and it feels like kind of stuck on the commercial viability piece here. And I think, amazing like admiration for going from, hey, we're open-minded to these, to we would prefer them. But I'd be really interested in kind of your thoughts on the pros and cons of like, at what point does it become required? Because there's certainly pros and cons there, and it's a question on like, is that what it's gonna take? Or could sort of education do it? But interested in your thoughts on that.
Dr. Marty.
So I would also like to emphasize that international coordination will be very important, because I've been on those committees where you have smaller companies who are not willing to take the NAM approach. So I say it's really important that that continues to move forward. I also like the idea of a framework on the acute oral toxicity. I think that CATMOS in a global model like that is the cornerstone of how to get that done, but I think we're probably going to need more in that space. So I think it would be really interesting to start maybe even looking at mechanistic connections. And so certainly PCRM and RTI just put out a paper on some mechanistic connections for acute oral. And that might be a little bit pie in the sky, but I don't think it'll be wasted effort, because many of those mechanisms also are related to repeat dose systemic toxicity. So I think there's an opportunity there to maybe start looking at how we could supplement the acute oral and maybe even leverage that more broadly.
Dr. Baines.
Yes, just want to say, first of all, I enjoyed the presentations. And I just want to just, make sure we don't forget that we should always try to bring in academic partners as much as possible. Again, especially with the, trying to do these admixture studies. I think it's really important to make sure we bring in academic institutions to help, to push that forward. That's a big, big feat, and I think everybody at the table will help move that quicker. So I just want to encourage. And when I say academic partners, all academic partners, not just the large universities, but all the schools can play a part in that. So I just wanted to just emphasize that. But good job again.
And Dr. Price.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great presentations, and I wanted to get into a little bit more, and I'm new to this, so I apologize if this is already covered in everything, but my question really got back to, I thought Nicole really made some really good points about how much work is left after the science is solved. And I'm just curious on regulatory acceptance rates, if there's any areas where we could show that NAMS is a safer path for companies as opposed to the animal testing, if there's any bubbles where that's true. Because I am sympathetic, just, on the company's side, that whatever your likely path of success is through regulatory is almost certainly where companies will go. And so I just don't know if we have demonstrations in any particular area, where it's been far enough where we could actually show that there is the higher, safer path for NAMS versus, for regulatory approvals.
Okay. Yeah, at the moment, there is no additional hands up. So I'd like to open it up for the speakers that have had any questions directed to them, if they want to respond. And Dr. Kleinstroyer, if you want to stop.
Thank you, Chair. So to work backwards, so to start with Dr. Price's question about regulatory acceptance rates and areas in which NAMS might be a safer path for companies in terms of success. I think it really depends on how you define safety, right? I think that you were defining it in terms of sort of safety from a business standpoint, right? So they want assurance that if they develop this data package, it will be considered and ultimately accepted by regulatory authorities. But that inherently depends on safety from a human health protection standpoint. And so we have examples, skin sensitization being the best developed, but I think also all the other topical toxicity endpoints too, skin irritation, eye irritation, where we have very robust evidence that the human-based NAMs provide much better human health protection than the animal models. The reason that we have that so clearly defined for skin sensitization is because we actually have human reference data to compare to. So from human predictive patch tests, so when people use a product and they have an allergic reaction, they get a patch test. And so we have compiled the largest ever data set of human reference data for this endpoint. And that was what allowed us to sort of unequivocally say these human-based new approach methodologies actually outperform the animal data when compared to the true gold standard, which is this human endpoint. So having that established, having an OECD guideline that falls under the mutual acceptance of data legal statute, which requires, all OECD member countries to accept data that is generated under an OECD test guideline. It doesn't require what they should do with that data. It's not, mutual acceptance of decision, it's mutual acceptance of data. But having that precedent where the safety standard has been elevated by the human relevant new approach methodologies should be sort of the discussion point that we take to regulatory agencies to say, listen, you now have a responsibility to evolve your assessment paradigms and your acceptance to adhere to that better, safer standard that is human relevant. And so having that communication, that sort of tripartite communication between the scientists and the validation bodies and the OECD that have really helped to codify those guidelines, and the regulatory agencies and the regulated industry, so that it's very clear to everyone involved that this is not just, a sort of more ethical approach or a more rapid or more efficient approach, but it's actually a more human health protective approach. That's going to be what's needed to create that safer path for companies in terms of success.
And is that path through the NAMs, is it more used than animal models today, or is it a lot less?
Not yet, I don't think, but Dr. Lowett can.
Because the one other point that I would make then is just, it feels to me that one of the best things we could do, and you're way more into this than I am, but is to focus on one narrow area where we think exactly the point you're mentioning, and sort of, for lack of a better word, sort of dominate that area and get that switch so that there's a real example case of, look, this is working better in an area, is probably a really strong way to go, even more than getting a smattering across lots of areas, even though the science is moving forward.
So you're asking a pretty complex question, and there's a lot of nuance, and we could probably talk about it for a couple of hours, to be honest. But I think there are a couple of points that Nicole didn't make that need to be made. So in the pesticide space, most developed countries have, for the most part, a common set of data requirements. Internationally, if one country, let's say it's the US or EFSA or Canada, moves faster at replacement or reduction in the animal use, what inevitably happens is the countries that are slower become the holdup. And that international harmonization in the pesticide space of pesticide data requirements is vitally important to this adoption of NAMs, because what happens is if, let's say, the US and Canada and EFSA will accept eye irritation assays, but Brazil and Japan and Korea do not, the animals get run, because most companies don't want to pay for the same thing to be tested in multiple, either the animal or the in vitro. They want to do one thing. And that's particularly true in the formulation space with small companies who don't have that kind of excess number. There are a couple of big companies who are just, because they think it's the right thing to do, are doing more in vitro and the animal in parallel. But that international harmonization space is absolutely vital, and it's a place where we really are challenged because in the pesticide space, unlike in pharmaceuticals, there's nothing ICH-like where everyone gets together and agrees on things. So it's a very difficult space. The industrial chemical space is quite different. In fact, that there is no internationally accepted data set for a new chemical to enter the market. In fact, in the US, many new chemicals brought into the market have little to nothing in terms of new data. So I moved over from the pesticide space to the industrial chemical space about a year and a half ago. And the openness to run these studies is actually huge in the industrial chemical space because they can be done faster. And a lot of companies are happy to do information if you tell them what to do and that they can do it in a matter of a few months, and it's not going to change their trajectory of their marketing or anything else. So from my personal perspective, and I don't have my agency because I don't have the disclaimer, but I got to say this is my personal view. In fact, the opportunities to accelerate much faster are in the industrial chemical space. People are really looking for guidance on what they can do to speed up their process. And we're starting to see the fruits of that internally. So.
Thank you. And Dr. Barron.
Just wanted to expand on Nathan's point that one way to potentially consider is rewarding sponsors that submit NIMS data. I know that that's another conversation. Probably have spent weeks discussing it. What kind of rewards will be provided, but I think that would definitely motivate sponsors in submitting that type of data.
Dr. Nunez?
Yeah, just a couple of quick comments that I think might be relevant to what's been discussed. There's been a lot of discussion about, whether or not something would be accepted, when the final submission is made. One thing to think about is there's a whole host of studies that happen before they ever get to their final candidate that they may submit data on or do, one study on. And I think that's really an opportunity to explore, the use of NAMs. Most companies, I can speak for pharma, do some version of that. We do an entire in vitro cardiotox battery before anything happens to go into maybe a 4-day rat tox study, something like that. It may be, I can, from personal experience, run 50 or 60 molecules before we find the right one that we're going to submit, our GLP tox package in. So it's important, what's going to be accepted or not, but there's also a whole piece of before that could still be some use and maybe a potential for people to start trying some of these out to see, one, if it's going to improve the speed, because that's always great. Cost is obviously, a big issue as well. And then, just the accuracy. So just some thoughts.
Any additional discussion items from any SICATA members or ad hoc members? They are welcome at this time, as well as any responses from speakers.
I just want to go back to a point that Dr. Ushio made about sort of at what stage does it become required to use NAMs? And I think that there's various phases to that requirement. So, for example, in the EU, under REACH, the registration and sort of the legal statute for chemical registration and risk or hazard assessment and classification and labeling, there is a requirement to consider NAMs, if available, prior to running the animal study. Now, the reality of the situation is that REACH has generated far more animal data than any other regulatory statute in the world in history. And so the sort of actuality of what that looks like has been divorced from, I think, the intention behind that. But it has generated sort of robust reference data that we should then be capitalizing off of to actually validate and establish confidence in replacement methods. But having some consideration for our regulatory partners to issue those same types of guidances, saying, but not just a general guidance like, oh, you should consider NAMs before you run an animal test, but in an endpoint-specific way, much like the EPA has done for some of the endpoints like skin sensitization, and now thinking about this decision tree framework for eye irritation, but having guidances that very clearly state, here are some existing NAMs that are very robust, that have been well validated. This is what you should consider prior to running the animal study, I think would be extremely helpful.
So I'll add the regulatory, add to that, because, ooh, I just did something to my screen. The word required has a lot of legal meaning. I think what you mean is preferred. What I hear is preferred.
So
because
just to clarify, I think my point is really, I think there's a lot in industry, there's a lot of reasons for companies not to do it, for I think a lot of what's been said. So I am asking, and I realize the bar is high, and I'm not necessarily even advocating for it, I'm just sort of curious, like, what are the pros and cons of required, and to your point, the legal and all these ramifications, which I'm sure come into play. I think that's what I'm interested in.
So I'll give you the two vantage points that I know pretty well, because as a couple of people have pointed out, FDA is not represented here in the room, and I think they have a very different suite of statutes and offices that do things quite differently. So from the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, so that's the pesticide office, and the toxics office, industrial chemicals. So if you start with the pesticide office, where a lot of this work has been done, as you've heard from Monique and Dave, there are a suite of data requirements under FIFRA that are fairly checkbox. But there's some legal nuance to that the agency is not allowed to tell companies which technology to do to fill those data requirements. So when the waivers drafts are written or the guidances are written, the Office of General Counsel does get involved to make sure we're using the right words about doing that. But a lot of that is just the communications that you hear from the pesticide program routinely on how, they view the NAMs as better science. We can use those kinds of words. We can't actually require someone to do eye irritation assays instead of a DRACE test. If someone chooses to do the DRACE test, that's their choice. From the industrial chemical side and the toxics office, from the new chemicals point of view, there are no data requirements. New chemicals are brought onto the market, as I said a few minutes ago, routinely with little to no chemical-specific information. It happens all the time. And so in that case, there is a great openness for suggestions of what information would be useful to help speed up the process or get a more favorable review. And in that case, as you saw in a matter of, I think, 10 seconds, a very complex framework we have actually an eye irritation framework that's on the verge, cross on my knees and toes, that we're not going to have a government shutdown. It'll go up for public comment in the next couple of weeks. But it's a very complex suite of things because that program can't also require. But they can say, we really like this assay because it's human relevant. And if you're going to do something, please do this one. But a company can choose to do something else, in which case they basically have to deal with what they have in front of them. And so the word require, I think what we really mean is preferred. And so it's really about how we talk about publicly that we would prefer you to do the NAMs because we think they're more human relevant. We would prefer you to do the NAMs because the DRACE test is not so good for a whole list of reasons.
Yeah, it's super helpful. And I think that and the comment that was made around, in some cases now we have it's better. And it reminded me, for those of you in pharma, the concept of CGMP. So there's like good manufacturing procedures. And they added the C, I don't know how many years ago, a long time ago, to say represent the current, because there was so much change. And I think it is a good, kind of, encourages, I think, everyone to think about what is the most current, what is the best, what's the most relevant, and maybe that's, that could apply some here in some way.
Okay, I am not seeing any additional points for discussion, and I don't see any speakers that want to make a comment. So before we talk about lunch, I have been notified that we have a note from Dr. Wojcik that Dr. Kleinstra is going to provide.
Thank you, Chair. Chris, if you wouldn't mind sharing the slide that I provided you. So this is to follow up on Dr. Wojcik's opening remarks, and this is very relevant to the discussion we're having about future directions and strategic planning. This is an overview of the complement animal research and experimentation concept that the NIH Common Fund is considering as a potential research program. So this is sort of our partners in this space. So NICEDM and ICFAM have been committed for decades to developing and validating and implementing NAMs in the space of toxicology. And the NIH has recently increased dramatically their investment in NAMs in the area of biomedical research. And so this is a potential common fund program, complementary, aimed at the development, standardization, validation, and use of NAMs in the area of basic science, of understanding human biology, disease mechanisms, and ultimately creating new platforms that will more accurately model human biology and are intended to either complement traditional animal models or ultimately replace traditional animal models and really transform the way that we do basic translational and clinical sciences. So for those of you in the room and online, you can scan the QR code on the slide here, and that will take you to an information page that has a little bit more information about this concept and has links to register for the listening sessions that Dr. Wojcik referred to that are being held throughout the month of October, pending the government staying open. The first on October 2nd is geared towards our industry and academic partners. On October 16th, our NGO representatives, and October 30th, our U.S. government and international partners. However, if you belong to any of these stakeholder groups and can't make the date that is sort of targeted towards your group, you are absolutely welcome to join any of the other listening sessions. We're just trying to manage numbers by dividing it up in that way. And we are also very eager to accept written comments from our stakeholders across the scientific community and the public. And there's an email address on this page that will allow you to submit written comments to the complementary concept planning team. So definitely wanted to highlight that for this audience because you are all experts in this realm. And I think that we all recognize that there's really a continuum between biomedical research and toxicology applications, because for us to ultimately have reliable, human-relevant platforms that allow us to make robust regulatory decisions about the impact of exogenous exposures on human biology and disease pathways, that needs to start in the biomedical research and the basic science realm. So this potential program, I think, will be incredibly beneficial for the scientific community, and ultimately will hope, if it gets formally approved and implemented, will support the development of NAMs that will someday transition into being standardized, validated platforms that can be used for toxicology in addition to biomedical research. So encourage all of you to participate in these. Thanks so much.
Catherine? Down here, sorry. I don't know which button was the flag button, but I wanted a quick comment, just that there was, I think, a general interest in how do we communicate or implement more NAMs for the replacement of the six-pack. And there are two talks this afternoon. One is on validation, which Anne Gourmelon will be speaking, and then also the update on guidance document 34, which Valerie will be speaking. The U.S. is active on both of these, I guess you could say, projects or initiatives. And so I would invite you to keep that perspective, like what is it that, would be helpful as we look forward to get more NAMs, right? Because we're trying to, take a look at what is it with the OECD and the test guideline program where we can better enable the test guideline program to receive NAMs. We know already there's a process, and how can we improve that process? And so as you hear those two talks this afternoon, keep that question in mind, and I'd be interested to hear any other comments that you have following those. Thanks.
Thank you. And we are now going to break for lunch, and we are slightly early, which is awesome. Good job, guys. And so we're going to reconvene in an hour and a half at 1:40. Thank you.